Amen and amen. Well, if you've got your Bibles with you, would you open up to Exodus chapter 12? Exodus chapter 12. We've been walking through the story of Exodus together, and we're finally at the moment of the Exodus. Everything up to this point has been setting the backdrop, the reason, the need for the Exodus. God's people have been enslaved, treated unjustly, victims of a genocidal maniac ruler in Pharaoh. And they've cried out to the Lord, and the Lord has remembered his promise. He's moved in power upon Pharaoh in Egypt. He has demonstrated time and time and time again that Yahweh, that God and God alone is supreme. That God and God alone is sovereign over creation. Not just a part of creation, not just an aspect of creation, but all of creation. He's not the God of one place or one people. He's not the God of one part of nature or one aspect of life. He's the God of creation. And he has demonstrated time and time again to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians that he is to be obeyed and honored. So we're finally at this moment of release, the moment of freedom from slavery. And I wonder if you've ever, like me in your life, wanted something really badly. Like wanted something so badly, and you didn't think you were going to get it, and then you got it. And then when you got it, it wasn't what you thought it was going to be at all. As I think about this text this morning, I mean, on one level, it is so amazing. It's finally happening. They're being set free. But I wonder if they weren't struggling with a little bit of the be careful what you wish for reality as the new reality of their life begins to unfold for them. So let's dive into the text. Starting in verse 33, it says this. It says, the Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. Now, there's some really important wordplay happening in the Hebrew text in which this was written that's not very easy to see here in the English. The two main words that have been repeated over and over and over again in the preceding chapters in this season of 10 signs, of 10 plagues, there's two words that have appeared over and over and over again. The first one is the word that is translated here as were urgent. It says the Egyptians were urgent. That word we've seen over and over and over again in the text, but we've seen it translated as strengthened or hardened. Over and over again, Moses would come before Pharaoh and say, send my people out. That's the major verb, the dominant verb of the narrative. Send my people out. But time and time again, either Pharaoh strengthened his own heart or Yahweh strengthened his heart to go his own way. And so time and time again, Pharaoh was strengthened or hardened to not send them out. We see that very clearly in a verse like Exodus 10:20. Yahweh strengthened Pharaoh's heart, hardened it, and he did not send them out. Let the people go. Now, in chapter 12, verse 33, not Pharaoh, but all of Egypt, all that Pharaoh ruled and controlled, all of the Egyptians are now strengthened to do exactly what God commanded. Send the Israelites out. It's a beautiful reminder of the faithfulness and the power of God. What God has demanded is exactly what comes to pass. And they're saying to themselves, if they don't go, we'll all be dead. Now, they're saying this after the night of terror, the night of the destroyer, the night when not a single house in Egypt didn't experience the death of a firstborn. That's just the 10th plague. They've witnessed the darkness and the hail, the locusts and the blood. They've suffered through strike after strike after strike. And they recognize their gods are incapable of protecting them. Pharaoh is unable to protect them. His own firstborn has just been killed. They look around and they say, clearly, no one can stand against Yahweh. If we do not give Yahweh what he wants, we'll all be dead. They're terrified. One commentator says this is ironic, for no people prepared more fully for death than the ancient Egyptians. They were obsessed with death. Their thinking, their worldview revolved around death and preparing for the afterlife. But death at the hands of a strange God was terrifying. What preparation could be made? What protection was there? With one voice and one mind, with one heart, the people of Egypt say, send them out, and send them out now. So the people took the dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in the cloaks on their shoulders. This is a departure in haste. This is not a long planned out reality. They have just come through the night of terror. They ate and celebrated the Passover meal for the first time with their sandals on their feet, their belts on their cloaks, and their staffs in their hands. Now they've got just minutes, maybe an hour, to prepare themselves, to get what they can grab, to figure out what they can carry and bring it with them. Bread was the staple food for all peoples in the ancient world. There was no life without bread. They don't even have time to prepare the bread in such a way to add the leaven and the yeast to it. They have to grab the unleavened dough and they wrap it up in the spare clothing that they're going to bring, sling it on their shoulders, and begin their journey into the unknown. Now, the people of Israel had done as Moses had told them to do. The one thing they'd done in preparation before all of this happened, they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing, and Yahweh had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they let them have what they asked. You know, there's a lot of supernatural stuff happening in Exodus. There's a lot of miracles. I don't denigrate this as one of the more significant ones. We love our stuff. Imagine, right? Like imagine, I just come up to you like, hey, that's a nice watch. Give it to me. Hey, I like that jacket. Give it to me. Hey, that thing that you've spent a lot of time working for that's worth a lot of value. I want it. Give it to me. And Yahweh moved upon the Egyptians that they were glad to give their wealth unto the Israelites on their way out. And then we get this phrase, and this is so significant because it begins to frame the rest of this text and the rest of the story. It says, thus they plundered the Egyptians. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Now, the Hebrew word there that's translated as plundered is a very specific Hebrew word that's always used in the context of battle. It means spoils. The spoils that go to a victor in a war. And so we realize that what's been going on has been a battle. It has been a war. It's been a war between Yahweh and Pharaoh. It's been a battle over the Israelites. It's been a battle that they've been in, but that they haven't fought because God fought for them. And God wins the battle. And so the victors plunder those that have been beaten. And they plunder the Egyptians. And what this begins to develop, and it's already been hinted at in the text, is that God is calling Israel not just to be his family, not just to be his people, not just to be a kingdom of priests, but he's calling them to be his instrument in the world. He's calling them to be his army. He's calling them to be his army. In fact, that's what he says over and over again in the text. If we go back to, say, Exodus chapter 7, verse 4, God speaking to Moses says, Pharaoh will not listen to you, but I will lay my hand on Egypt, and I will bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. That word there that is translated as hosts means armies. The Lord, from the beginning, has said, I'm not only going to bring out a people, I'm going to bring out a people that are my hosts, that are my armies. They are going to be my instrument of judgment and justice, as well as redemption and rescue. Israel is being rescued that they might be made into something of the Lord for his purpose. I will bring them out by great acts of judgment. I will bring them out as my hosts, my armies. And we're back to chapter 12. It says, and the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. So they begin the journey. They leave this place where they are. We don't exactly know where it is. We know that it's somewhere in mid-northern Egypt at the time. And they begin to make this journey to another city that we don't exactly know where it is, Succoth. But what we know is they began to make the journey. And then the end of this text is a text that has generated considerable controversy and challenges. It says about 600,000 men on foot besides the women and children. So it says, here come the people. They're coming out of the land. And it says that what comes out are 600,000 men on foot, and then the women and children above it. And so just with kind of simple math, you look at it and say, okay, well, if there's 600,000 men, fighting men on foot, and then women and children, you come up with a number of well over 2 million people. And that's a challenge because historically and archaeologically and with everything that we know about the ancient Near East and ancient Egypt, which is significant, that's a number that doesn't work. It's simply a number that's not sustainable. And so there have been many that have said, see, the Bible is not trustworthy. The Bible is full of errors and contradictions, and this is one of those verses that will be used. There's simply no logical, historical, realistic way that over 2 million people left Egypt and journeyed through the wilderness into the land of Canaan. It's not really a problem when we look deeply at the Hebrew language itself, though. And in order to understand what it's communicating here, we need to understand the context that I just introduced, this idea of hosts, this idea of a military fighting unit. First off, the word that's translated there, or two words for men on foot, is a specific military term that means foot soldiers. So these are the fighting men, those who are able to protect and defend and fight. So these are those that are actually engaged or able to engage in warfare. The word that is translated thousand, well, it's an interesting word in the Hebrew language with a very wide semantic range. It's a word that's translated in a lot of different ways. It can be translated as thousand. It can be translated as cattle. It can be translated as ox. It can be translated as ox herd. It can be translated as clan or tribe. Here's the way this word works. The root of the word literally started out meaning an ox, a male cattle, a bull. And the way that ancients would do their animal husbandry and have their flocks is that you would have a flock centered around one bull. You'd have one male and a whole bunch of females, okay? And so in the ancient world, if you were walking around and looking in pastures and looking around, you would see an ox surrounded by the female cattle. And so the word that started out meaning the singular male ox becomes known as the grouping around the ox. Are you with me this morning? So this is how language evolves and is used, okay? And so instead, the word becomes fluid. If you want to talk about a single ox, you can use the word. If you want to talk about the group of oxen around the single ox, then it works that way. So it comes to be a word that's used to describe a grouping of people. And so we encounter it many times in the Old Testament talking about family units, tribes, the 12 tribes, the clans within the tribes. In the same way that you'd talk about a group of cattle, it describes a group of people. And when it's used in a military context, which this text is, it's describing the group of fighters, foot soldiers, within a specific clan. So I think the best way to translate this text would be something like this. The people journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, and about 600 clans of foot soldiers. We organize today by counties or states or countries. In the ancient Near East, they organized by family units, and not just a nuclear family, but an extended family, a clan, a tribe. Identity was wrapped up in that reality, and military units, armies, were formed based on clans. So this is a text describing the army of the Lord departing in victory from Egypt. And so the author says there were 600 clans of foot soldiers. So there's 600 different extended family units that have raised up within their family units the fighting men that they have. Ancient historians and scholars that have studied this, these family units are not huge. Some of these family units might have had 2 or 4 or 6 soldiers, men that were of fighting age and able to engage in warfare. A larger one might have had 20, maybe 25, but these are not massive units. I think it's fair to assume that, let's assume an average of 12 per clan. If there's 12 foot soldiers, 12 fighting men in each clan, and there's 600 of them, then we've got a fighting force of about 7,200, which would be a very significant army in that time in the ancient Near East. It also would then give us a total population of somewhere between 28,000 and 36,000, a number that fits within the historical cultural context of the ancient Near East, and it fits into the biblical narrative. You know, one of the things that's going to happen is God leads them out of Egypt. He's going to lead them into the land of promise, the land of Canaan. But Canaan is not uninhabited. Canaan is inhabited by people that have earned the judgment of God. And God is going to use the nation of Israel as his instrument of judgment upon the peoples in the land, but they're not going to go in and overwhelm by their superior might in warfare. In fact, God tells them, you're going to go into the land. In that land are 7 other peoples that are more numerous than yourself. So we have this exodus of 30, 40, 50,000 people coming out, grouped by family units with their foot soldiers leading them, guarding the children, the elderly, the weak, and leaving. In addition, verse 38 tells us something really significant that I'm not going to have time to unpack this morning, but it says this. It says, a mixed multitude also went with them. The Hebrew there for mixed multitude literally means ethnically diverse grouping of people. I think a very common misconception in the Protestant church today is that we think about Israel in the Old Testament, we think about it primarily as an ethnic, genetic reality. And there is something to the descendants of Abram, the descendant of David. There is a genetic sort of thing that's happening there, the offspring, the seed. But there's a misunderstanding that says, in the Old Testament it was about this genetically singular group, Israel, and now in the New Testament, because of Jesus, it's about everybody. It's never been just about one group of people. Israel was composed from its very beginning here as a nation of a diverse group, an ethnically diverse group of people. Moses himself marries a Cushite, an African. We know that as we continue to walk through the story, there are multiple people and multiple names that reflect different cultures and different languages that are a part of the covenant community because they've been led by Yahweh out of Israel. And the group that receives the covenant and the law on Sinai is an ethnically mixed group. This verse ends and it says, and they brought out very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And literally it says they brought out a heavy flock. There's that word, again, that we've seen over and over again, that kavod, it's translated as heavy or weighty. It's translated as glory. In some ways, the battle between Pharaoh and Yahweh is who's the heaviest, who's the most substantial. God has revealed that he is the heavy one. He is the one that is solid. He is the one that what he says happens. He is the one that has the glory, the weight. And so now when his people march out in victory, they're loaded down with the plunder of the Egyptians, and they bring out a very heavy flock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. So now is when we need to look at this text and really do our best to understand and imagine what is being described here. I think it's far too easy to read this text quickly and only look at the positives in it. Only look at, wow, God set them free. But think about what that meant for the Israelites. I mean, just on a physical level. They've had to stay up all night. They had to listen to the cries of the Egyptians as every household has a firstborn killed. They had to hear the cries of the Egyptians as they said, get them out of here. They had to, in haste, put together what they could carry and leave everything they've ever known, walking with only what they could carry. They had to walk out into the wilderness, without even really knowing where they're going. Can you imagine your 8-year-old, your 12-year-old, your addled father whose mind may not be there what it was used to be going, where are we going? We're following Moses. Where's he going? That way. Well, what are we going to eat? Well, we brought some unleavened bread. So imagine you walk all day in the heat. You got kids and animals. You don't really know where you're going. You're carrying the plunder. You're like, God set us free, but we don't really know where we're going. And all we've ever known, we just had to leave. So you've been up for 24 hours. You've walked. And now you sit down to eat hardtack bread, unleavened bread. And think about what just happened. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. 430 years. See, don't read past that. I think sometimes we read past verses like this to get to the good stuff. There's a reality that's being described here. I mean, we just came out of the 4th of July celebration, independence, celebrating the birth of our nation. We're not even close to 430 years yet. Like we're not even there. For 430 years, they'd lived in Egypt. So it's all they've known. It's all their parents knew. It's all their grandparents knew. It's all their great-grandparents knew. It's all their great-great-grandparents knew. 430 years is enough time for at least 15 generations in the ancient world. For 15 generations, all they've known is Egypt. Oh, they had stories. They had their stories of Abram and Isaac and Jacob. They had their stories of the covenant promise. They had their stories of how God brought the people to Egypt. But for 430 years, all they'd known was Egypt. Now they're being set free. But set free to the unknown. Now, it's unknown to them. It was not unknown to God. One of the things that I love about the Exodus story is how it is simply demonstrating the faithfulness of God. What God says He's going to do, He makes happen. You know, if we look back to Genesis chapter 15, and this is when God first called and began to covenant with Abram, that He promised Abram, who is married to Sarai, and even though they're old, they have not yet had a child because Sarai is barren. God calls them and promises that He's going to make them into a great nation, that He's going to bless them, that He's going to give them an offspring. But God says to him here, He says, Yahweh said to Abram, I want you to know for certain. There's a lot of things that you can't know. There's a lot of things that you don't know. There are many things that you won't know, but this you can know. Know for certain that your offspring, which he doesn't even have yet, by the way, your offspring will become sojourners, foreigners, immigrants. They're going to be dispossessed and displaced in a land that is not theirs, and they will be servants there. This was not unknown to God. This was not outside of God's purview. This was all a part of God's plan. He says, and they will be afflicted there for 400 years. For 400 years. And again, so many people looking for an excuse to discredit the Scriptures will want to say, well, in Exodus it said 430, and here it said 400. And I was like, oh, that's a real problem. I'm like, only if you want it to be. Only if you treat the text in a way that the text does not deserve to be treated. When God makes this promise, He says you're going to be there for 400 years. Like God didn't have a calculator, and He was going, okay, 365 days times 400, that's exactly how many days that you're going to be there. That's not how God worked this out. Like you're going to be there for 400 years. They were there for 430 years. Does that qualify as 400 years? Yes. Interestingly enough, both numbers are quoted in the New Testament. So Stephen, you remember Stephen? He's one of the first martyrs in the book of Acts. He stands up and he recounts the history of God in Israel, and they don't like it, so they stone him to death. But when he quotes it in Acts chapter 7, he's quoting about this Abraham event in Genesis 15, and he uses the number 400. Now, Paul quotes it in Galatians chapter 3, and he's quoting it about the giving of the law at Sinai, and he uses the number from Exodus, the 430 number. So it's like, this is not a discrepancy. This is not a contradiction. This is just a simple, it's the use of language and numbers that are not used in a scientifically precise way because it's not a scientifically precise culture. Sorry, I just read way too many commentaries this week that were like, well, anyway. See, people that want to find problems with the Scripture because they don't want God to be God will look for anything and make something out of nothing. They will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. That's the story we've just been in. That's the story we've just been reading. It's the story of the Exodus. God kept his word to Abram. He gave Abraham and Sarah a child, Isaac. He continued the covenant through Isaac to Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. The covenant goes to the 12 sons, the tribes of Jacob, and the people, the offspring of Abram, are led into a foreign land, and there they serve for 400 years, and then God comes not only to rescue them, but to bring judgment upon the nation that abused them. And that's the story that we're in. God is bringing them out. But I wonder, as they sat around the campfires that night, as they laid their children to bed on cloaks with stones for pillows, whether they wished they were back at home in their beds. There's a reality that God has moved and God has rescued and God has brought them out, but he's brought them out to the unknown. To the unknown. And the more I study the Scriptures, the more I think about how God has moved, it almost seems like God takes this perverse pleasure in calling his people to the unknown. And there's a reason for that. It's actually how we've been designed to function as men and women made in the Imago Dei. What it means to be imagers is that we are designed not for independence. We're designed for radical dependence upon God and interdependence with each other and with God. We were made to walk by faith and not by sight. The problem is every single one of us have this broken nature, this sinful nature, and the essence of sin is the desire to control. We don't want to walk by faith. Can we be honest enough this morning? To say that if it was up to us, if we could design the plan, if we could lay out the system, faith wouldn't be a part of it. When I look into my own heart, when I look at how much of the modern church practice is designed not to help us walk by faith, but to help us, to protect us from walking by faith, because we don't like the unknown. We feel entitled, feel like if I have a question, if I want to know something, then God owes me the answer. And we'll justify it. It's like, well, if God really loves me, then he'll tell me what I want to know. If God really loves me, he'll lay it out. Church, God really loves you. And there are many things that he won't lay out for you. Because God is always, and God will always call us to walk by faith and not by sight. I mean, think about Abraham, right? Yeah, God calls him to walk into the unknown. Genesis chapter 12, right? God says to Abram, where's Abram? Well, he's living in his father's tent in Ur of Chaldea. So, he's doing what everybody did in the ancient Near East. You live in your clan. You live in your family unit. He's married. His wife, and they have not had their own children. They're dwelling in a very successful, prosperous, trading family. And God comes to him and says, well, what does he say? I want you to leave your country. I want you to leave your kindred. I want you to leave your father's house. I want you to follow me. Where are we going? Well, I want you to go to the land that I will show you. He doesn't even tell him. I mean, think about it. God, the call of Abraham, who is the father of faith. I mean, he believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. God comes to him and says, I want you to leave everything you've known so that you can follow me. Where are we going? I'll show you when we get there. This is how God calls us. God wants us to trust him. It's like so much of what we do is try to orchestrate and organize our lives so we don't have to trust God. We're called to walk by faith. Think about the early church, right? The early church, the disciples, man. The disciples put all their hope. They went all in with Jesus. And then instead of him setting Israel free and destroying the Romans, he dies on a cross. He's buried. They have their hopes shattered. And then the impossible happens. The resurrected Christ shows up. They touch his hands. They touch the wound in his side. He eats with them. He reveals himself to up to 500 people at a time. Jesus is back. Jesus is with them. He establishes the new covenant. The church is born. And in Acts 1, verse 6, it says that when they'd come together, they asked him, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? They're thinking, all right, what's the next step? Okay, you rose from the dead, so now you're going to take out Rome. Now you're going to put Israel back on top. Now you're going to march to our drum. You're going to fulfill our expectation. Jesus' response is not what we would like it to be. It's just not. Jesus says to them, that is not for you to know. That is not for you to know. There are things that God has planned and organized in the future that are not for you to know. He says there are times and seasons that the Father is fixed by his own authority. Jesus is saying, hey, that's above your pay grade. That's not what you even need to be worried about. You're not entitled to that information. That information won't even serve you. But here is what you can know. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and then you can be my witnesses. There is an ignorance that is designed by God. There are questions that God will not answer for us in real time because those questions and those answers will not help us do what God has called and designed us to do. There are all sorts of things that are unknown. And God is calling us into the unknown. Now, there's so much in the church today, in the world today, that longs for safety. Right? Don't we see it and hear it everywhere? We need safe spaces. Safe spaces in our schools, safe spaces in the military, safe spaces in our churches. We need trigger warnings, and we need safety, we need safety, we need safety. And here's the reality, y'all. There is no such thing as safety in a world that is still broken by sin. It's all an illusion and a delusion, if we think we have it or we can keep it. We walk in a world that is ravaged by sin and the consequence of sin, which is death. We walk in a world that is embattled by rebels both on the earth and in the heavenlies that have rejected God's rightful rule and are doing everything that they can to destroy his kingdom and his people. We live in a broken world. And so the call of Jesus on my life and on your life is not the call to comfort and convenience. It's not the call to safety and knowledge. It's the same call it's always been. It is the call to faith. We are called to walk by faith. And that means God is calling us into experiences and places and activities and ministries that we don't have the skill or the strength or the power to pull off. That we're going to find ourselves following God in places and situations where if God doesn't show up, we will be undone. And that is exactly what Jesus is calling us to. I know in my own life and in 30 years of ministry, I've sat with many people who have been called, they're being called by God. Either into a relationship with him or into a ministry or into something that scares them. And so often they work their way into my office hoping that I will give them an excuse to not do what God is asking them to do. We're called to walk by faith. I want to close with a text by the Apostle Paul written to the church in Corinth. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. And Paul is really dealing here with the reality of following Jesus in faith and the consequences that brings. It doesn't make our lives easier, simpler, cleaner. It often makes it much more difficult. Paul writes this. He says, we do not lose heart, which I find amazing because he's just, the life of Paul, and he's just described. He's been shipwrecked, he's been abandoned, he's been stoned and left for dead. He's been scourged and beaten multiple times. Like everywhere he goes, he faces opposition and opponents who want to destroy him. He's being imprisoned for the gospel of Jesus Christ. But he says, we do not lose heart. Even though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. He's not safe. He doesn't know safety. He knows risk. He knows the unknown. Because Jesus has called him to follow him. He says, though our outer self is wasting away, inwardly we're being renewed day by day for this light and momentary affliction. I can barely wrap my brain around this. Like I get a bad hair day and I don't want to leave the house. He's been left for dead. In fact, he may have died one of the times he was beaten. He talks about ascending into the third heavens and receiving a vision that he's not allowed to talk about. It's very possible he actually died and God's like, oh, you're not done yet, go back. This is the kind of suffering he's living with on a daily basis, right? And he's like, it is light and momentary affliction it is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory that is beyond all comparison. It's perspective. We get stuck on this stuff. We get stuck on the stuff that scares us. We get stuck on the unknown. We get caught up in the temporary. He's not denying it. He owns it. Like, it's real, it's hard, it's brutal, it's ugly, it hurts. But at the end of the day, he calls it a light and momentary affliction. Every time I read this, I think about going to the redwoods. Ever been to the redwood forest of Northern California? I love it because it makes me feel young and small. Two things that I regularly want to feel. And you get into that, you step into the redwood and there's a sense of time. It's like these trees have been around long before we were born, and they'll be around long after we're gone. And they're immense, they're huge. And so we get this perspective. Like you think you're a big deal, and then you walk in, you stand in the redwoods, and you're like, oh, a little bit of perspective. That's what Paul is trying to say. Like, yeah, there's a lot of pain living by faith, walking in a broken world. But in perspective, it actually doesn't even compare. This light and momentary affliction, he said, is preparing us for a weight of glory beyond compare. And we look to the things that are, we do not look to the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. For the things that we see are transient, temporal, but the things that are unseen are eternal, permanent. We know that if the tent, our body, we know that the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed. Like, the worst thing that this world can do to me is make this body die. Well, that's not the end of the story. We know that if this tent is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. In this tent we groan, and the older we get, the more we groan. In this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, that what is mortal may be swallowed by life. And this is a drum that I keep banging, because I think one of the greatest misunderstandings of the gospel in the evangelical church today is that if we put our faith in Jesus, when we die, we float off as some spirit to some place called heaven. We get away from this evil, wicked earth, and we float off and do spirit stuff in some spirit place. And church, that's not the gospel. The gospel is that our mortal bodies are going to be swallowed up, not by death, but by life. That there is another body waiting for us. We're not going to be unclothed. We're not going to be left naked. God is preparing for us an incorruptible, eternal body that will last forever and ever in the new heavens and the new earth. We're not going to escape this world. God is going to redeem and rescue this world, and we will dwell with Him forever. This is our hope. This is our hope. And so Paul's saying, whatever you do to this body, yeah, you can hurt it. Yeah, you can kill it. But death is not the end of the story for us, because Jesus has defeated death, hell, and the grave. And so what is mortal will be swallowed up, not by death, but by life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always of good courage. We're not of good courage because things are going our way. We're not of good courage because everybody's agreeing with us. We're not of good courage because our lives are comfortable and convenient in the Spirit. No, in the Spirit keeps propelling and compelling Paul to bring the gospel into dangerous and dark places, because that's where the light is needed. We're of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, because we walk by faith, and not by sight. See, the walk of men and women made by God for God is always and will always be a walk of faith and not sight. I don't even think in the eternal age that changes. I don't think our need for dependence upon God will ever go away. I don't think, I know, and I hear it at funerals all the time, like, oh, when we're dead or we're resurrected, then we're going to know everything. That's not anywhere in the scriptures I've ever found. Only God knows everything. We'll have and enjoy an eternity, a future, in an incorruptible body where we will continue to walk by faith and not by sight. We'll continue to look to God to be our protector and provider. We will continue to enjoy the grace and generosity and faithfulness of our God because that's who He is and that's who we are. We are those who are made by God to walk by faith and not by sight. May God help us and strengthen us and give us the good courage that Paul talks about to trust Him as He leads us day by day into the unknown. Amen?